There is a huge mistake in how we think about the fall of Rome. We often imagine a single day when the city walls broke and the empire vanished. But the truth is that the collapse started inside the government's own pockets long before any foreign army arrived. In the year 117, Rome was at its peak. It controlled the entire Mediterranean, thousands of miles of roads, and a gold supply that seemed endless. It was a closed system, self-sufficient, proud, and seemingly untouchable. But the gears of that power had already started to grind. It didn't fall because of a sudden attack. It fell because of a series of money decisions that turned the world's greatest superpower into a hollow shell. If you looked at Rome in the 2nd century, you would see a state that wanted for nothing. The government controlled the mines, the grain trade, and the strongest army on earth. But the empire had a problem. It was built on the idea of constant growth. To pay its soldiers and keep its cities running, it needed a steady flow of new land and new gold from war. When the borders stopped moving, the gold stopped coming in. But the bills kept getting bigger. The government was desperate. They needed a way to pay for their massive army and their huge cities without any new riches. What they found was a specific trick with their coins that targeted the very foundation of Roman law and trust. By the time the emperors realized what was happening, the money that had built their temples was losing its value at a terrifying rate. The economy didn't just slow down, it flipped. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire was dismantled not by an army, but by a choice to lie about the value of its own money. Before we look at the first moves in this money war, tell me in the comments, do you think a government today could make the same mistake with its currency? To understand the collapse, you have to understand how Rome paid for its power. In the early days, the Roman silver coin, the denarius, was the only currency that mattered. It was almost pure silver. This gave the government incredible trust. They set the rules. They told merchants from Egypt to Britain that this coin was worth a specific amount of bread or iron. This trust was the silver sink of the world. Because everyone wanted Roman coins, the government could buy whatever it needed to keep the peace. But by the late 2nd century, the government faced a financial crisis. The cost of the army was exploding. Soldiers wanted higher pay to defend the long borders, and the emperors needed to keep them happy to stay in power. With no new wars bringing in piles of gold, the treasury was running dry. If they didn't find a way to pay the troops, they would face a total military revolt. The emperors tried to raise taxes, but the people were already squeezed. They couldn't take more from the farmers without causing a rebellion at home. That's when the emperors shifted their strategy. They realized that if they couldn't find more silver, they would simply use less of it. They began a process called debasement. They took the silver coins, melted them down, and mixed in cheap metals like copper. At first, the coin looked the same. It still had the emperor's face on it. But instead of being 95% silver, it was 85%, then 75%, then 50%. They were making more coins out of the same pile of silver. They thought they had found a way to pay their bills for free. The impact was immediate but hidden. For the first time in history, the trust in Roman money began to vanish. Instead of silver being a steady measure of value, it became a moving target. The silver trap had been sprung. The Roman government, which relied on these coins to buy loyalty and supplies, suddenly found that its money was worth less every year. The price of goods began to skyrocket. This meant that the government had to print even more bad coins to pay for the same amount of grain or armor. They had found the one thing that could break Rome's economic armor from the inside. The drop in silver was not just a number on a page. It was a force that changed how every Roman lived. As the coins became cheaper, the people who sold food and clothes noticed. They realized that the money they were getting for their hard work was mostly copper, not silver. To protect themselves, they did the only thing they could. They raised their prices. If a bag of grain cost 1 silver coin yesterday, it cost 2 today and 4 next month. This is called inflation. And in Rome, it moved like a wildfire. The government tried to fight back with force. Instead of admitting the money was bad, they blamed the merchants. The Emperor Diocletian even made a set of rules called the Edict on Maximum Prices. He listed thousands of items, from beef to haircuts, and said that anyone who charged more than his set price would be killed. But you cannot use a sword to stop the rules of trade, because the power. Merchants couldn't make a profit at the government's low prices. They simply stopped selling. The stores went empty, and the markets vanished. This led to a massive shift in how the empire functioned. Because the money was now worthless, people stopped using it. They went back to barter, which is trading one physical thing for another. A farmer would give a blacksmith a bag of olives in exchange for a new tool. While this worked for neighbors, it was a disaster for the government. How do you collect taxes in olives and wool? How do you send a wagon of grain from Egypt to a soldier on the German border before it rots? The government's ability to move power across long distances was dying. The most dangerous part was what this did to the army. The soldiers were paid in these worthless coins. When they realized they couldn't buy anything with their pay, they stopped being loyal to Rome. They started being loyal only to the generals who promised them real gold or land. This meant the army was no longer a single force defending a nation. It was a group of private gangs fighting each other for whatever was left. The government had traded the trust of its people for a few extra coins, and now it was paying the price with a total loss of control. By the 3rd century, the Roman government was no longer a stable authority. It was a state in a constant panic. Because the money was failing, the government could no longer rely on people to volunteer for jobs or sell goods to the state. To keep the army supplied, the emperors stopped asking and started taking. They created a system of liturgies, where they forced wealthy citizens to pay for public works out of their own pockets. They also forced workers to stay in their jobs forever. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. This was an attempt to freeze the economy in place to stop the bleeding, but it only created more pressure. The sheer size of the empire made this central control impossible to manage. To try and fix the chaos, the Emperor Diocletian decided to split the empire into 2 parts, the East and the West. He believed that 2 smaller governments would be easier to run than one giant one. But this split actually made the money problem worse for the West. The East was where the trade routes and the rich cities were located. When the empire divided, the East kept its gold and silver, while the West was left with the crumbling roads, the expensive borders, and the worthless copper coins. As the West ran out of real money, it lost its ability to pay for professional soldiers. Instead of the disciplined Roman legions of the past, the government began hiring mercenaries, foreign fighters who fought for pay, not for Rome. Because the treasury was empty, these fighters were often paid in land rather than gold. This meant the government was slowly giving away its own territory just to keep the borders safe for one more year. The state was not just losing its money, it was losing the very ground it stood on. By the late 4th century, the Roman government's desperation for money had turned into a war against its own taxpayers. Because the coins were nearly worthless, the state demanded taxes in physical goods, grain, wine, and meat. This required a massive army of officials just to collect and move the food, which cost even more money. To make sure the tax money didn't stop, the government passed laws that tied farmers to their land. You could no longer leave your village to find a better life. You were legally forced to work for the state. This pressure caused a massive shift in where people lived. The middle class in the cities, the people who actually ran the markets and the local governments, began to vanish. They couldn't pay the heavy taxes, and they couldn't survive the rising prices. To escape the government's reach, they fled to the deep countryside. They moved in onto the massive estates of the ultra-wealthy, known as villas. These villas were like small private kingdoms. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and had their own private guards. This was a disaster for the central government. Every person who moved to a private villa was a person who no longer paid taxes to Rome and no longer followed Rome's rules. The empire was literally dissolving into thousands of pieces. The cities, which had been the heart of Roman power, began to crumble and shrink. The grand public buildings were left to rot because there was no money for maintenance. Rome was losing its grip on its people, not because of a foreign king, but because it had made the cost of being Roman too high to pay. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire reached its final breaking point. The government was effectively bankrupt, with no way to pay for the professional army required to hold back external forces. The long-term policy of hiring foreign mercenaries backfired when the state could no longer provide the gold or land promised to them. Because the central government had lost control over its money and its trade routes, it could no longer react to threats. When the borders finally collapsed, there was no money left to rebuild the defenses. The collapse was not a failure of Roman bravery, but a failure of a specific set of rules. By trying to cheat the value of their coins, the emperors destroyed the trust that held the Mediterranean economy together. They chose to fund a massive military and a heavy government by lying about their silver supply, making the eventual loss of power inevitable. When the gold and silver were gone, The government was exposed as a hollow shell that couldn't even move food to its own soldiers or collect taxes from its own people. The story of Rome is a lesson in the power of money and the danger of ignoring the rules of trade. A superpower can have the largest buildings and the most territory, but if it cannot maintain a stable way to pay for its needs, it cannot survive. Rome didn't end because of a single battle. It ended because it ran out of the trust and the resources required to exist as a unified state. It was an empire built on a foundation of growth, and when the money finally failed, the walls followed.